I'm Gail Kislevitz, and I will be the host for this segment. Today, we have a very special guest, running legend, Amby Burfoot. Hi, Amby.
Gail, it's great to be here. It's great to be on Gotta Run. It's too bad we're going to have to gotta sit for a while, but I'm looking forward to it.
I know, we might have to take a break and do some stretches or lunges. But I have to give you a full disclosure. Amby and I are really good friends. We are summer running partners, although his easy run is my tempo run. And we are running and writing partners as well. So running, writing, and friends for a long, long time. So it's interesting to be in this side of the seat across from you.
And our brand new book is called Runspirations, and it has just come out, and we think it's a great little book and a great gift.
We do, and we'll talk about that later. But for some of you who may not know of Amby's list of accomplishments, and if those people exist, I don't know who they are, I'm just going to go through the short list of your accomplishments. Number one, as a senior at Wesleyan, you won the 1968 Boston Marathon at age 21 in a time of 2:22:17. Pretty amazing, pretty awesome. Later that year, not to rest on your laurels, you ran a PR of 2:14:28 at the Fukuoka Marathon in Japan. Then, most people probably know you as the editor-at-large of Runner's World for a lot of years, 1985 to 2012. So we have to talk about those years as well. And then one of your favorite things is that you have run 50 straight Manchester Road races, which is a small race, not that small actually, in Manchester, Connecticut on Thanksgiving Day. So that's just the short list of some of your accomplishments.
And the only important correction is that I've now run 57 consecutive Manchesters as of a week or two ago. I'd like to say my proudest accomplishment in running, I often tell people, it's easy to win the Boston Marathon. You just train your ass off,
easy for
like
you.
Everybody does, and then you get lucky on race day. But it's not easy to run the same road race 57 years in a row. That takes some guts and grit and determination, so I'm quite proud of that streak.
And didn't you also have a streak of wins at Manchester?
Back in the days that I can barely remember, I won it 9 times. Now I'm just happy to see that finish line and cross it and notch off another year.
Another year. Well, there's so many things we have to talk about today, so I thought maybe we should start at the beginning. Many people probably don't know that running was not your first sport, that you had another sport you had a passion for.
I like to brag that unlike a lot of skinny, uncoordinated runners, which is what I look like, I was actually a pretty good athlete as a teenager. The reason being that my father was a YMCA director, so I got involved and introduced to all the mainstream sports. In fact, the very last year that I played organized baseball, I won the batting championship in what was called the Babe Ruth League that I played in.
Wow.
I also won the Good Sportsmanship Award, but I don't like to talk about that one.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, the batting championship is better. And then in high school, in 10th grade, I went out for the basketball team because I thought I was a good basketball player.
Well, you got the height.
I was a good shooter, but I had no court sense. I wasn't used to playing on the court with scrappy guys. So I was the last man on the team. The coach put me in once when we were behind by 43 points and there were 12 seconds left. But what happened, the reason that basketball is important to the story is one day we were having a bad practice and the coach was ticked off at us. He was like, "Get off of my court. I don't want you to see you guys anymore. For punishment, you have to run the cross-country course."
Oh.
He sent us out on the 3-mile cross-country course. I started running. 200 yards later, all my basketball friends stopped running because they couldn't go any further. I kept going. I came back and finished way, way before them. And so then I made this decision. Would you like to be the worst player on the basketball team? Or maybe you should try this cross-country thing, which fortunately is what I did.
Yeah, fortunately for everybody. And you had a legendary coach in high school.
Well, I had the best coach ever in high school and beyond, and it made all the difference in my life. And his mentorship meant everything to me and is one reason that I always try to pass it along and to help others and answer questions, mentor people, be friendly, be encouraging. His name was John J. Kelly, and he was a Boston Marathon winner. He was not to be confused with John A. Kelly, the old
older
John, who won Boston twice. Young John won Boston once, but he was also on 2 Olympic teams. He won the National Marathon Championship in Yonkers, New York, 8 years consecutively.
Tough course.
Absolute tough, hot course. Absolutely the acknowledged best distance runner in the United States from the mid-50s to the mid-60s. And beyond that, and this is the part I really like to talk about, he was the smartest person I've ever met. He was the most aware. He was like a Renaissance man. He was so far ahead of his times. In the 1950s, he was organic gardening. In the 1950s, he was riding his bicycle to his teaching job at the high school so he wouldn't pollute the environment by driving a car. He was a literature scholar. He was a philosopher. He loved running through the natural environment. We never did repeats on the track. We ran through the apple orchards and around Bluff Point State Park on the shores of Long Island Sound. So he taught us how to love running, and that made all the difference.
He also loved to quote everybody from Kerouac to Dylan to Shakespeare.
He read absolutely everything and everyone and could discourse on all the great themes of our day. And as I said, he was way, way ahead of everybody else. He was opposed to overgrown Pentagon and defense budgets and just everything that is now sort of second nature to many was a point that he espoused way before most people.
I read somewhere that you had a class across the hall from him, and his classroom was always having fun, and yours was not. So
well,
did you ever have him as a teacher?
I didn't have him as a teacher. I was in sort of the advanced English classes, and he had a master's degree in remedial reading teaching. So he was teaching the ruffians in class, basically, and they weren't having so much fun as they were wrecking chaos in his room, because he's 5'5", and the ruffians on the football team were 6'5", and it was kind of frightening to look over to the class. He did not belong in a high school classroom. He belonged in a college or graduate degree classroom. That's not where he was, so he made the best of it.
He was a free spirit.
He was.
So from there, you go to Wesleyan. And you had some interesting roommates and teammates at Wesleyan.
Just by chance, and totally by random chance, because Wesleyan is not an athletic powerhouse. There aren't athletic scholarships. No one's trying to recruit runners. But at the time that I was at Wesleyan, Jeff Galloway was there a year before me. And Jeff has been one of the mainstays of American running for the last 50 years. And 2 years after I was there, when I was a junior, Bill Rogers arrives from Newington.
Did you recruit
I recruited Bill a little bit. I saw him running in Connecticut cross-country races because my brother was in the same races and beat Bill once or twice. But at any rate, the story, the fact that Jeff Galloway, Amby Burfoot, and Bill Rogers were all contemporaneously at this small New England non-athletic liberal arts college is about 1 billion to 1 chance. Yeah. And yet it happened, and I think we each, in our unique ways, had an influence on American running over the last 50 years.
You must have had quite a team. Did you have any titles?
We had crummy teams. There were 5 of us. We had 5 good runners, maybe sometimes 3. We didn't have depth. It wasn't running boom days. There were no recruited athletes. We couldn't do anything on the team basis. But as individuals, we had some stars. And
having Bill Rogers as a roommate, I mean, you two couldn't be more opposite. It had to be quite interesting. And I was just at a running event, and Bill was talking, and the fact that you two were roommates came up in the conversation. And he said he remembers that you were so driven to win that marathon, and that you would constantly play from Don Quixote to dream the impossible dream over and over and over again.
Guilty as charged. That is true. My musical tastes were not expansive, but when I latched onto something like The Impossible Dream, I really latched onto it. I was driven when I was in college. I was obsessive. I tell people, I was in college in the 60s, sex, drugs, rock and roll. Zero, zilch. I did none of that.
You missed out.
Well, yeah, I missed out. What I did was I ran, and I ran 120 miles a week when I was in college. Bill Rogers was not Bill Rogers yet. He was a flaky cross-country runner at Wesleyan, but it was 5 or 6 years later that in his own time he turned on his talent and started winning things. But I was an obsessive runner in college, and to an extent still am. And I just put everything into trying to be as good as I could be in college.
Well, it worked.
We had an annual pickup meet in September against Yale University. They had a guy named Frank Shorter on their cross-country team. Cleaned him out real easy.
Really?
Yeah, no problem. But these were guys who had more talent than me ultimately. I just dug down and got mine at an earlier age than they did.
I remember reading something about Bill talking about a weekend when John Kelly came down to visit you guys, and you all went for a run together. And Bill at the end said, "Man, that old man kept up with us." So, I mean, when we talk about old man, at the time, John was probably, what, 30?
Exactly. And we had an older man running with us who we all remember very well named Charlie Doc Robbins. He was running barefoot in the 50s before anyone had ever heard of barefoot running. When the temperature went down to 40 degrees, he'd put on a pair of socks because he thought it was too cold. When it went under 30, he'd put on a pair of $3 boat sneakers or something like that. But most of the time he was running barefoot. He was a national champion at 20K. He was a top 10 finisher at Boston once or twice. And he was another one of these idiosyncratic, crazy-looking runners who were around in the day who actually were quite smart and really knew what they were doing and were very talented, too.
And back in the day, even though we're not talking that long ago, running was so different than it was today. When you ran Boston, there were not even water stops.
Yeah, we didn't have water stops. We had little kids handing out oranges on the side of the road, and half of the time it was a lemon, and you didn't know what it was until you stuffed it in your face and realized
a lemon. What was that supposed to do for you?
What did I just do? The kids didn't know, and we were moving too fast to consider what it was we were biting into. But I remember some sour moments in the Boston Marathon.
And even sneakers and shoes. There were no running shoes as we know them today. I think I remember even Bill, when he won his first Boston, borrowed a pair of shoes.
Running shoe industry was not an industry. It was not, no one could possibly imagine how far the sport has come since then in terms of shoes and drinks and cross training and all the assorted things, running magazines, running books, running TV shows. There was no way to imagine that in the 60s because it was just a really, really small-time sport.
Runners were weirdos.
That's how we were regarded, for sure.
That's how we were regarded.
Yeah.
So I recently read your account from, I think it was the 2007 issue of Runner's World, of winning the Boston Marathon, and it was so moving. And you talked about the shadow. Can you just give us a glimpse into that day?
Well, since you've warmed me up, I know what you're referring to. Basically, I was very fit that day. I thought I would run well. I had a little inkling that I might run very well. Halfway through the race, I was in the middle of the pack of 10 or 12 leaders. I thought, well, I'll do a little surge. So I did a little surge, and I thought maybe one person would drop back. Instead, the entire field disappeared behind me with the exception of one other runner. This is the last thing I wanted. We still had 13 miles to go. I wanted to run in a nice, comfortable pack for another 10 miles and see how I felt. Instead, it was one-on-one. It was mano-a-mano. It was a very sunny, warm day. And when we got to the hills, I knew my only chance to win was to beat this guy on the hills.
Now, did you know who this guy was?
I knew who he was. He knew who I was. We both knew that he was a better miler. He had a better kick. He was going to win at the end if he was there. So in my head, you got to break away on the hills. You got to break away on the hills. So on the 4 Heartbreak Hills, the 4 hills in Newton, I'm just killing myself up each hill, trying to drop him. He's running a half stride behind me. I can't hear him, but the sun is in the west. We're heading easterly, so his shadow comes out in front of my shadow. So I'm killing myself. I don't see him because he's back there, but his shadow is in front of me. I can see his shadow is still there.
Oh my
I
gosh.
get to the top of Heartbreak Hill. I'm completely spent. If I haven't won by now, it's not going to happen. I look down, and the blankety-blank shadow is still right there. I'm like depressed as all get out. I remember a moment when I kind of slumped with fatigue and wonder if I could keep going on. And a couple of moments later, I looked down, and the shadow was gone. And I couldn't believe it, but he cramped on the downhills. As all Boston.
So you're in the last 5 miles.
This is in the last 5 miles coming off of Boston College. As all Boston runners know, the downhills are harder than the uphills, and his legs cramped up on him on the downhills, and I got ahead of him. I suffered like crazy the last 5 miles. I looked back constantly. I couldn't believe I was in the lead, but he wasn't able to get it going, and so I won by about 100 yards.
Oh my gosh. That was a very heroic, epic run. And it still stays with you today, I can tell.
It stays with you. You don't forget moments like that. And you know, I was 21. It happened young. People should not normally win the Boston Marathon when they were 21. Of course, I had put in 3 or 4 years of running 100 miles a week. I had been schooled by Kelly. I had run dozens of New England road races from 15K to 25K. I was young, but I was a veteran. I knew what I was doing out there. But the main thing was I just had a day when everything clicked, and I was so lucky that that happened, because believe me, you win Boston once, what do you want next?
Yeah.
Twice.
Yeah.
And I went back to Boston other years in really, really good shape and just never had the same kind of day.
But you didn't stop. You went on to Japan and set a PR.
I went on to Fukuoka, Japan that December, and there in a world-class field, cool conditions, a flat course, everybody just runs 5-minute pace from the get-go. I held 5-minute pace for about 25K for 15 miles. And then I slowed a little bit, but I finished in 2:14, 5:08 pace overall. And at the time, it was 1 second slower than the American record.
Oh,
so
my,
I didn't.
1 second?
1 second. I always say.
Do you know what 1 second
Curse
is? It's
those
like
Japanese. Nobody told me. They should have yelled in Japanese at me. Kick,
That's
Amby,
right.
kick.
1 more second.
But, you know, it was a great race. You know, it was a perfect cap to the year for me, and you know, nothing but fond memories.
You went on to try to make the Olympic team.
I got injured the next year, several months before the Olympic team, trials. My last college track meet, I thought, well, I should run the steeplechase. There it is. You got to run the steeplechase. And last time in my life, I'll have a chance to do it. So I got in the steeplechase. I ran in last place for 2 laps, and I thought, why is everybody running so slow? So on the 3rd lap, I circled the whole field and went into the lead and won the steeplechase. And I had won the 3 mile the hour before in the New England Championships in Boston. And then the next morning, I woke up and I couldn't lift my butt out of bed because I didn't know what I was doing hurdling, and I had pulled a muscle in my leg with all that hurdling. And I very stupidly frittered away the next couple of months and was not in shape at the trials and dropped out.
That's too bad. What a regret.
You
could have medaled.
can't relive them. You can't rerun them.
cannot go
and
back.
we
You
all
cannot
make
go
a
back.
lot of mistakes on this long road.
We do. We do. But from there, you had an incredible career at Runner's World. How did that all come together?
Runner's World was a wonderful gift. In 1978, I got a letter. Can you believe letters?
Letter.
I got
People
a
wrote
letter
letters.
from the publisher of Runner's World, Bob Anderson. He said, we're doing pretty well. We've got all these people out in our West Coast office. We need an East Coast editor. How would you like to be our East Coast editor? I'm like, how would I like to work for Runner's World? Do you pay people for that?
That's right.
You know, we had a
Sign me up.
meeting. We had a meeting a month later at the Boston Marathon, did a handshake, and before I knew it, I was the East Coast editor of Runner's World. The whole operation was back in Palo Alto, but I was the guy that got to go to Boston and New York, and when there was a big story in Europe, I flew to Seb Coe's doorstep and interviewed Seb Coe when he was running mile records. When anything else was happening in Europe, I was the one who got to go on the trip, so that was pretty cool. And to work for Runner's World and to write about a subject that you love so passionately, that you know pretty darn well, was just the most incredible career a person could possibly have. It was the best and luckiest thing that ever happened to me.
You were at a lot of big events, like the very first Women's Olympic Marathon.
I was at the first Women's Olympic Marathon in '84 when Joni came into the stadium, and we all cried, because what else are you going to do when Joni comes in the first Olympic marathon? I got to go to many Olympics and World Championships. I remember the Cuckoo's Nest in Beijing and Usain Bolt's first 100-meter world record in the Olympics, and being just this far above him in the stands, because we get the best seats. You know, it's incredible, the press seats, and to watch him in that margin of victory and his incredible talent was special. But there's so many wonderful memories, so many tremendous people that I've met, and really my period in the sport, I think, was the best period the sport will ever know, because it was the period of this explosive growth of the great heroes named Bill and Frank and Joni and Greta and others. And then you have the Kenyan Revolution, which comes along in the 80s and 90s, and we see this tremendous growth of talent from the East African countries, and just so much going on. And you know, you can never recreate the first bloom of anything, and I was there for much of that bloom, and it was just a fantastic ride.
You were also there when running sort of transformed itself from a sport that was all about the elites and winning to a sport that embraced everybody.
Like when I ran the marathon with Oprah.
Yes.
I was at the Marine Corps Marathon in 1994. I'm going on memory now. And I was just giving a clinic, and suddenly we hear that Oprah Winfrey is running the marathon the next day. And I'm like, well, I'm here. I'm the editor of Runner's World. Oprah is the most famous person who's ever attempted to run a marathon. I guess I better watch this up close. So I went down to the 3-mile mark. She comes by. I jumped in the crowd behind her, and I ran the next 23 miles with Oprah Winfrey at Marine Corps. And I have to say, it was the most courageous marathon I have ever seen anyone run, because Oprah was trained and fit, and of course she's got $1 bazillion, but that doesn't help you run a marathon. She was scared out of her mind about the distance, and all the way she had people coming up to her and clapping her on the shoulder.
Oh,
Oprah, I watch your show every day. It's so great that you're out here. We love you.
She does not want to hear.
Moment after moment after moment, this repeats itself thousands of times. And in the early going, she was trying to be personable and friendly, and she would say, oh, thank you, I appreciate it. But after 15 miles, you can't do that anymore.
And you
the
get tired
pats
of
are
it.
still coming. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't do anything but look at the road and run. But she kept looking. She kept running. She had that great finish up the Iwo Jima Hill at the end of Marine Corps, and she had bodyguards. Also, people from the National Enquirer were running beside her because they wanted the story more than Runner's World. And they had 2 of them who had flown in. They had photographers who were all over her. The moment I remember the best was about 20 miles. We went by some porta-johns. She'd been drinking a lot. She's given one the eye, and I'm like, she wants to go to the porta-john so bad because she's been over drinking. But she's not going to let the National Enquirer take
that
pictures.
Would not be the picture she wants. Going in
So
and out of the porta-john.
she just hung in there and held on to it and kept running, and did great.
So with all the people that you interviewed or ran with over the course of your long career at Runner's World, was there anyone that you were sort of starstruck by?
I was starstruck by many of them. I mean, that's just what happens, you know. what's coming to mind first is not quite starstruck, but I went and interviewed Greta Thunberg the morning after her first victory in New York City.
Oh, she hardly spoke English then.
She hardly spoke, and remember, nobody knew who she was. No one expected her to win. I mean, Pred knew, we knew, but nobody in the U.S. knew that she was a great European cross-country and 3,000-meter runner. So she's there the next morning. Somehow I find out what her hotel room is. I call up, can I come up and interview you? She and Jack invite me up to the room. You know, this is like their second day in New York City. It looks like every single runner's hotel room, right? Clothes all over the place,
smelly,
drying and
dirty.
and smelly and dirty. She's on the phone to her principal back in Norway trying to explain why she's not going to be home today because she had to go on the Today Show.
That's funny.
She doesn't know what the Today Show is. He doesn't know, but she's trying to explain all this stuff to him. And they were just as wonderful and helpful and friendly and willing to give an interview to this guy from Runner's World. They probably barely knew Runner's World. They certainly didn't know me, although we soon became friends. And people basically all through my career were like that as long as you showed them that what you were really interested in was running and their running. I went down and interviewed Zola Budd on the farm in South Africa 2 months before she became the biggest story in the world because her father immigrated her to London and somehow they got her on the British team so she could run in the Olympics against Mary Slaney, her hero. She couldn't run from South Africa because they were banned from the Olympics. But I was sitting in her bedroom playing with her stuffed toys. She had these big stuffed animal toys and going out for runs and just, you know, living the dream.
But some of the people you interviewed weren't exactly famous runners, like Will Ferrell.
After Oprah Winfrey, my next favorite marathon is running with Will Ferrell, and that was 2003. He got in shape to run the Boston Marathon, and what happened was it turned out he and I were going to run the same pace. We were going to run 4-hour pace. And my wife.
That's pretty fast for him.
Yes. No, he was really in shape like Oprah. These guys, I mean, they're not all in shape, but they work at it for a while. They get in shape. Anyway, I'm going to run 4-hour pace. My wife and daughter are going to run the last 6 miles with me because it's my 35th anniversary or something. It's a little bit of a year for me. So I promised them that we're going to run 4-hour pace, 9 minutes and 10 seconds, downhill from Heartbreak Hill to the finish, and they can do that. Until then, I'm going to run with Will Ferrell. It's one of the warm, sunny days of Boston. Will Ferrell's dressed in all black. The sweat is just pouring off this guy. 3 miles into the race, I'm like, this is not going to happen. Will Ferrell, good luck to you. He hangs in there for 10 miles. 10 miles, he just totally disappears. So that's it. It's all over. See you later, Will Ferrell. So the next 10 miles, I'm only thinking of my wife and daughter. They're at the 20.
He's not with you. He disappears.
He's gone. He's just gone. They're at the top of Heartbreak Hill. I come running up to them. We're going to run the celebrity last 5 miles together. I come running to my wife and daughter, give them a big hail. Will Ferrell goes soaring by me on the other side of the road.
No way!
And I'm looking at my wife and daughter. I'm looking at Will Ferrell, and I'm like, okay, let's go get Will. He's running like 8:40 pace. So I go taking off after Will Ferrell. My wife chases after me. She says, what the F are you doing? You told us you were going to run slow with us, and he's going too fast, and make up your mind, you know?
Me or Will?
Yeah, me or Will, and in case you're having trouble, and she actually said this, let me just remind you, we're going to love you a lot longer than Will Ferrell is. So I stroked my chinny chin, tried to decide what to do, and I dropped back and ran to the finish with my wife and daughter. And Will Ferrell finished in 3:58. He just stormed the last 6 miles.
Where did he go during those 10 miles?
His coach told him to slow down because it was warm. They ran negative splits, you know?
Wow.
People can do amazing things when they're ready and when they're coached and when they run smart.
That is so interesting. So all your years at Runner's World, as I said, we spanned so many generations, and you brought the sport to the people. Did you have like a favorite cover or a favorite moment while you were working there?
I'm going to sort of dodge your question because I can't think of a good answer and turn it slightly. One of the things people ask about Runner's World and 50 years in the sport is how have things changed? Okay, it's a wonderful question, and we can talk about shoes, and we can talk about everything else. But there have been two big changes. Number two is masters runners, masters runners, masters runners, older runners. When I first started running, there was only old John Kelly. He was about 55 then, and we all thought he was like the oldest man on the face of the earth, because who kept running when they were 55? You know, I'm almost 20 years older than that now, and I'm not about to think about quitting. And of course, the biggest change, number one, is women, women, women. Literally in my first races, in my first Boston Marathon in 1965, there were 0 women in the Boston Marathon. The next year is Roberta Gibb, number 1 in 1966. And so the advent of women into this sport is both the biggest and the best thing that has happened in the last 50 years of running.
And now I think women are more, I think at the last New York City Marathon, I think 55% of all entrants were female.
I think they're the majority, and they unquestionably hold the key to the future, because for better or worse, and we're not going to debate this one, women are at the center of the family, and the women are at the center of getting their husbands to do something if they can, and certainly trying to set an example to their kids. And kids don't need mothers or anyone else chasing them out the door to run when they're 7 years old. But simply seeing a mother who's active and healthy and vibrant is something that they're always going to carry with them.
Yeah.
And at the time when it's appropriate for them to run, maybe they will.
Yeah. We need to talk about our book. I mean, we need to be run-inspired here.
I think what's important about Runspirations and Run Inspired is that when I was editor of Runner's World, we had 4 horsemen of the magazine. Everybody wanted to know about shoes, everybody wanted to know about training, everybody wanted to know about nutrition, and everybody wanted to know about injury prevention. And then they started over again. There were only 4 interests. It was really hard to be the editor of Runner's World. Nobody else wanted anything but those 4 things. The 5th thing they would ask for, though, was inspiration. We want you to give us inspiration. And
How
I
do
would
I get
sit
out the
there
door?
and scratch my head and say, how do I give anybody inspiration? Doesn't that come from within? Isn't that ultimately your responsibility? But I think with books like this and others, we're at least trying to tell people, here are some good ways you can be inspired. You can be inspired by the stories of other people like Oprah Winfrey. You can be inspired by some of the things we have learned through 50 years of running. In the book, we call it timeless wisdom. It's not how much to run Monday morning. It's the big questions about running.
The big picture.
The big picture. And of course, the motivational quotes. Every single one of us loves motivational quotes and probably have them draped around and have favorites and things like that.
This actually came out of a run you and I were taking, and probably around Groton Long Point, and you said, I have this word, I have this title, it's called Runspirations, and I went, that's amazing. We need to write that book. And I think a year later, here's the book.
The reason I said that in the middle of a run was because I was trying to rope in your energy to get me moving forward with the project, and I'm so glad that I did, and
it was so much fun.
So fantastic working with you, Gail.
It was easy.
It was not easy. I will never, ever say that writing a book was easy.
I don't know. I had a lot of fun doing it. I loved the stories. I loved working with you. I think that our energy was really both spot on, and we never argued.
Well, I love the fact that we worked it out on the run. What better way to do it? To go out on a run and talk about various things and then come back in our various homes. You're in New Jersey, I'm in Connecticut most of the time, except when we get together for runs. And we had enough connection between us to be able to get through any rough spots.
Well, we were very run-inspired. And I hope a lot of people will become run-inspired.
I hope so.
So thank you, Amby. Thank you for coming down from Connecticut on this rainy day and being a part of this show and just chatting.
Thank you for your energy and interest and the wonderful questions.
Oh, you're welcome. I also want to thank the Manhattan Neighborhood Network for the use of this wonderful studio. It's always a pleasure to be here. And of course, we'll Sanchez, who his history of capturing our sport through all of these segments and interviews is really one way to keep the history of our sport alive. So thank you, Will. And with that, Amby and I, we got to run. What's going to be our next run?
Well, when are you coming up to Connecticut? I've just had a wonderful conversation with my friend Gail Kislevitz on the Gotta Run with Will show, and I hope you'll check it out on YouTube. There are a couple of things I didn't get to say in the interview that I want to tell you about now, little secret stories. One is that Gail and I have a secret commitment to run next year's 50th anniversary of the New York City Marathon, to run it together, to train and to run it together. I have a life goal, which is every time some race celebrates its 100th anniversary, I want to be there on the starting line. I don't think I'm going to make it to the 100th anniversary of the New York City Marathon, so I'm going to aim for the 50th anniversary next November. That seems like a good goal to shoot for. And two, a long, deep, historical and personal anecdote that relates back to almost the origins of New York road runners. I was a 17-year-old kid in Groton, Connecticut in the summer of 1964 when somewhere I found an address for what was then called the New York Roadrunners Club. And I wrote them a letter and I said, I understand you've got cross-country races and other events during the summer. Is that true? Could you tell me about them? And I got a letter back with all the events listed, but also a hand-scrawled note from Joe Kleinerman. Not a name that many people remember any longer, but a name that we remember from the 60s and 70s and 80s particularly. Joe was one of those guys who just kept the spirit and heart and warmth and friendship of New York Roadrunners alive. And for me, a young kid in Connecticut, to get an actual hand-scrawled note from a living, breathing human being way back then, early in my running career, it made a difference. It told me that there were truly wonderful people at the heart of this sport, and it's one of the things that has kept me going for so long. And speaking of going for so long, gotta run. It's time now.
You know, it has been such a pleasure to sit here and speak with my friend Amby Burfoot all about running and the Boston Marathon and Runner's World, and it really is a capsule of the history of our sport. And I'm a huge fan of the history of our sport, and I think it's really, really important that our generation of first-time runners really capture and keep the history going. I had the pleasure the other night of going and listening to Gary Corbett, son of Ted Corbett, speak about his dad right before the Ted Corbett 15K. And he had some wonderful pioneers in the sport up there, like Gary Murky, who won the very first New York City Marathon, and Nina Cusick, who won the very first official Boston Marathon for women. And I'm sitting there thinking, how lucky am I to be a part of this and to know this and actually call some of these people my friend. And then when I was down at the Philadelphia Expo for the Philadelphia Marathon, Bill Rogers and Bart Yasso, another pioneer of our sport, were giving a talk. So of course I had to go and listen to these two legends. And as I'm standing there listening to them give their banter and talk about the old days and, you know, running when there wasn't any goo or any specialized sneakers or no water stops at marathons, there were some younger runners passing behind me, and they'd stop and they'd say, who are those guys? And it was all I had not to turn around and say, how dare you not know that that is Bill Rogers and Bart Yasso? And it hurt me that they don't know or don't care to learn about the sport, because the history is what makes our sport and what makes it so special. And we have gone through so much and since the beginning of our sport to now, and it's become such an all-inclusive, wonderful, wonderful sport that gets people through depression. It gets people through good days and bad days. And how many times have you ever heard a runner say, Thank God I got my run in today. So I think we're all lucky to be runners, but we also need to take that extra step to learn more about our sport and keep this history going. And with that, I gotta run.